My sister texted me while I was still on base boots, half unlaced uniform top folded over the back of a chair. The message was short and clean, like it had been drafted twice before she hit send. Don't come tonight. It's all elites. You don't belong. No greeting, no explanation. Just a decision delivered by text like a calendar update I was expected to accept. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. Tonight was the charity gala my parents had been planning for months. The kind with valet parking donor walls and people who say things like circling back without irony. I had known about it for weeks. I had even been told casually that I'd be there. Not as a speaker, not as part of the story, just present. That was apparently too much. I set the phone down on the metal desk and finished unlacing my boots. Around me, the bass was winding down in its usual way. Someone laughed down the hall. A door slammed. The soda machine hummed like it always did. Nothing about the world had changed except the part that involved my family deciding I was an inconvenience. I didn't text back. That wasn't a strategy. It was instinct. In my family, responding too fast meant you were emotional. Responding too slow meant you were difficult. Silence was the only move that didn't give them anything to use. I changed into sweats and sat on the edge of the bed. For a second, I considered driving off base anyway. Not to crash the gala, but just to remind them I existed. Then I imagined walking into a room full of people who'd been prepped to look through me, and I stayed where I was. My sister Vanessa had always been good at framing things as logistics. This wasn't personal. This was about optics. Don't come tonight wasn't an insult. It was a scheduling adjustment. Elites only wasn't classism. It was curation. You don't belong wasn't cruelty. It was honesty. That was how she'd explain it later if she ever did. I turned on the TV muted and let it run in the background. The local news showed traffic by the harbor. Somewhere downtown, my parents were greeting donors and shaking hands. Vanessa would be working the room, smiling just enough, making sure everyone saw her with the right people at the right moments. She had that skill. I had always known she would. On base, no one cared who my parents were or how many people recognized our last name. Here, you showed up on time, you did your job, and you didn't make excuses. If you messed up, it went on paper. If you did well, it went on paper. Everything went on paper. It was simple. That was the part my family never understood. I checked my phone again. No new messages. I wasn't surprised. The text hadn't been an opening to a conversation. It had been the end of one. I thought about the last time I'd been at a family event like this. I'd stood near the bar in a borrowed dress, listening to people ask Vanessa what she did for work. When they asked me, the answers got shorter. Oh, the Navy. That's great. Thank you for your service. Then their eyes slid past me to someone more useful. I had learned to smile and step aside without being asked. Tonight I didn't have to do that. Tonight I stayed where I was on government-issued furniture in a room that smelled faintly like detergent and coffee. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Around 8, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my mother. A missed call. No voicemail. I let it sit. If she had something to say, she could say it without a stage behind her. She didn't call back. I reheated leftovers in the common microwave and ate standing up. I scrolled through social media without really looking. A few familiar faces popped up in photos tagged at the gala venue. Crystal glasses. Linen suits. A step and repeat, with the family name printed too large to miss. I closed the app before I could zoom in. People like to imagine that moments like this feel dramatic, that there's a swell of emotion, a clear sense of loss. What I felt was quieter, a tightening. The kind you get when you realize a door wasn't just closed, it had been locked for a while, and you'd only just noticed. I had joined the Navy to get away from that feeling. Not the parties, but the constant measuring. Who mattered? Who fit? Who reflected well? On base, no one asked if I belonged. They assumed I did until I proved otherwise. Another buzz. This time, it was a text from Vanessa. Just one line. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. I read it once and put the phone face down. Harder for who was the question she never asked. I sat back on the bed and let the noise of the building settle. Somewhere nearby, someone was arguing about sports. Down the hall, a TV laugh track cut through the air. Life went on in small, ordinary ways. Whatever tonight was for my family, it wasn't for me. That much had been made clear. What they hadn't considered was that cutting someone out doesn't end the relationship. It just changes where the balance sits. I didn't need to announce anything or prove a point. I stayed exactly where I was, doing exactly what I always did, letting the silence do the work it was already doing on its own. I woke up the next morning before my alarm, the room still dim, my phone face down where I'd left it. I didn't reach for it right away. That was a habit I'd learned over time, give the day a few seconds before letting other people's expectations crawl into it. When I finally checked, there were no new messages. No apology, no clarification. Just the same silence I'd gone to sleep with. That silence felt familiar. It was the same one I'd grown up around long before I ever put on a uniform. In my family, everything had a hierarchy, even when no one said it out loud. Conversations, invitations, compliments, and at the top of all of it was my sister. Vanessa was 2 years older than me and somehow always seemed 10 steps ahead. She didn't just do well. She fit. Teachers liked her. Parents trusted her. Strangers assumed she was in charge before she even opened her mouth. I learned early that if Vanessa spoke, people listened. If I spoke right after they checked their watches. At family dinners, she sat closer to my parents, leaning in as they talked about work and connections and plans. I sat wherever there was space. When guests came over, they asked her about school internships, future goals. When they asked me, it was usually one question followed by a polite nod and a quick pivot back to her. No one was cruel about it. That was the tricky part. It was all done with smiles. With praise that sounded fair until you paid attention to who got it most. Vanessa was impressive. I was independent. Vanessa was a natural leader. I was doing my own thing. Those labels stuck. They followed us into adulthood like permanent name tags. By the time we were in high school, the difference was obvious. Vanessa was already being groomed for the kind of life my parents understood. Debate club, student council, summer programs that came with recommendation letters and photo ops. She learned how to shake hands properly and remember names. She knew when to speak and when to let silence do the work. I learned how to disappear. That wasn't self-pity. It was survival. When you realize early that attention is a limited resource, you stop fighting for it. You find other ways to measure yourself. Other rooms where you don't have to compete. For my parents, success was visible. It showed up in introductions and invitations. It showed up in who recognized our last name and who returned calls quickly. Vanessa fit perfectly into that system. She didn't question it. She didn't push against it. She made it look effortless. I didn't. When I told them I was considering the Navy, my father paused like he was waiting for the punchline. My mother smiled the way people do when they think you're joking, but don't want to embarrass you. Vanessa didn't say much at all. She just tilted her head and asked if I was sure. They all said the same things, just in different tones. You don't have to do that. You have options. That seems extreme. None of them asked why. They didn't need to. To them, the reason was obvious. I didn't know how to play the game. After I enlisted, their pride came in waves. They posted photos on holidays. They mentioned my service when it made them look balanced and open-minded. But it was always an add-on. Vanessa's achievements were the headline. Mine were the fine print. At gatherings, people thanked me for my service like they were checking a box. Then they turned back to Vanessa and asked about her latest project, her connections, her plans. I watched her answer smoothly, always making it sound like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. I didn't resent her for that. Not really. I resented the assumption that there was only room for one version of success in our family, and that it had already been claimed. Over time, I stopped trying to explain myself. I didn't argue when they forgot my schedule or mixed up my assignments. I didn't correct them when they simplified my job into something vague and convenient. It was easier to let them believe what they wanted than to fight for space they'd already decided I didn't need. Vanessa never had to push me aside. The system did that for her. From her perspective, everything probably made sense. She showed up. She performed. She carried the image forward. I was the outlier, the variable, the one who complicated the story. By the time we were both adults, the roles were locked in. Vanessa handled the family-facing world. I existed somewhere off to the side, useful, when my background added credibility, invisible when it didn't. That's why her text hadn't shocked me. It hadn't even surprised me. It was just the cleanest version of a rule I'd lived with for years. Don't disrupt the setting. Don't confuse the audience. Don't show up where you don't fit the narrative. As I got ready for the day, pulling my hair back and checking the mirror out of habit, I thought about how easily that rule had been enforced. No raised voices, no confrontation, just a simple message that assumed compliance. I left the room and headed down the hall, nodding to a couple of people I passed. No one here knew my sister's name. No one cared where I'd been invited or excluded. They cared whether I showed up on time and did my job. That contrast followed me through the morning, quiet but constant. Two worlds. Two sets of expectations. One where belonging was decided for you. One where it had to be earned over and over without shortcuts. I didn't know yet how much those differences were about to matter. I just knew that whatever my family thought they were protecting that night, it wasn't me. And whatever they thought I lacked, it wasn't awareness. I tightened the strap on my cover and stepped into the morning air without thinking about who I was leaving behind. The routine had a way of clearing things out of my head. You move, you adjust, you fall in with the pace around you. Whatever else is going on gets sorted later or it doesn't. Either way, the day doesn't wait. I hadn't joined the Navy to prove a point. That's the story people like to tell, the clean version that fits into a sentence. The truth was messier. I joined because it was the first place I could see where expectations were written down instead of implied. You knew what you were responsible for. You knew how you'd be evaluated. You knew who outranked you and why. There was no guessing game. At home, everything felt like a performance with rules no one explained. You were supposed to know when to speak and when to fade into the background. You were supposed to understand which achievements counted and which ones were nice but inconvenient. I was bad at that. I always had been. Boot camp stripped that out of me fast. No one cared if I was quiet. No one cared if I wasn't charming. They cared if I followed instructions, learned quickly, and didn't make excuses. When I messed up, I got corrected. When I did something right, it was noted. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. That felt fair in a way nothing else ever had. The first time a chief corrected me, it wasn't gentle. He didn't soften it or explain how it might look. He told me exactly what was wrong and what to do differently next time. Then he moved on. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting for the part where I was dismissed as a problem. It didn't come. There was just the expectation that I'd fix it and keep going. That was the moment I realized I could breathe there. As my career moved forward, I gravitated toward logistics and compliance without really planning to. It made sense. I liked systems. I liked knowing where things were supposed to be and why. I liked rules that existed for a reason, not just because someone with influence preferred them that way. My evaluations reflected that. Consistent, reliable, detail-oriented, not flashy, solid. At home, those words never landed the same way. Reliable sounded boring. Detail-oriented sounded small. Solid sounded like settling. Vanessa, meanwhile, was building a life that looked exactly like what my parents had imagined. Her world was introductions and follow-ups. Dinners where the right people noticed you. Conversations that felt casual but were anything but. She understood how to make people feel important while still getting what she wanted. It was a skill. I'll give her that. When my parents talked about her, their voices changed. There was pride there, sure, but also relief. She was carrying the story forward. She made sense to them. When they talked about me, it was different. They were proud in theory. In practice, they didn't know what to do with a daughter whose accomplishments didn't translate well at cocktail parties. They couldn't summarize my job in a way that impressed their friends, so they stopped trying. I learned not to take it personally, or at least I learned how to act like I didn't. In the Navy, I was just another officer doing her job. No one cared where I came from. No one asked who my family knew. The only thing that followed me was my record, and that felt earned. It wasn't perfect. I made mistakes. I missed things. I got corrected. But none of it came with judgment about whether I belonged there in the first place. That distinction mattered more than I realized at the time. There was a briefing early on one of those sessions everyone half listens to until a phrase sticks. The speaker was talking about accountability, about protecting yourself and your team. He said, if it's not on paper, it didn't happen. He wasn't being dramatic. He was being practical. That line stayed with me. In my family, everything happened off the record. Promises were implied. Boundaries were flexible. Expectations shifted depending on who was watching. If something went wrong, the story adjusted itself until no one with power looked bad. It worked for them. It didn't work for me. I started applying that Navy mindset everywhere without realizing it. I followed up conversations with emails. I clarified responsibilities in writing. I didn't assume goodwill where there was none stated. It wasn't distrust. It was clarity. When I went home on leave, the contrast got sharper. I'd sit at the table listening to plans being made without me in mind. Vanessa would talk through upcoming events, new connections, things that mattered in her world. I'd nod, add a comment here and there, and watch how easily the room oriented around her. Sometimes my parents would turn to me and ask how work was going. Not specifics, just the general question. I learned to answer it in a way that didn't slow things down. Good. Busy. That was enough. I didn't resent them for not understanding my job. I resented the assumption that if they didn't understand it, it didn't fully count. Back on base, that assumption didn't exist. People expected you to carry your weight. They didn't need you to explain your value beyond that. If you could do the job, you stayed. If you couldn't, you didn't. It was blunt, sometimes unforgiving, but never confusing. That clarity changed how I saw everything else. It made the way my family operated feel less like tradition and more like convenience. It made me realize how much energy I'd spent trying not to disrupt a system that was never built to include me. By the time my sisters started reaching out more regularly, I was used to living in those two worlds without mixing them. I didn't talk about work unless asked. I didn't volunteer opinions unless they were relevant. I kept things clean and separate because that was easier than explaining why they should care. Looking back, that separation probably made it easier for her to justify what came next. From her perspective, I was already halfway out of the picture. The Navy had me. Her world didn't need me unless I could be useful. I walked into the office that morning with a stack of reports under my arm and a calendar full of routine meetings. Nothing about the day felt unusual. That was the thing about choices you make early. They don't announce their consequences. They just sit there waiting to be pulled into situations you never expected them to touch. I was halfway through reviewing a shipment log when my phone vibrated against the desk, the kind of short buzz that tells you someone expects an answer. I didn't look at it right away. On base, you finish what's in front of you before you reach for distractions. When I finally checked, it was Vanessa. That alone was unusual. We weren't the kind of sisters who texted casually. Her message was friendly in tone, almost careful. She said she had a question. Nothing big, just needed my perspective on something work-related. She added a smiley face at the end, which felt forced, like a signature she didn't normally use. I told her I could talk later. That was true. It was also a test. When we spoke that evening, she didn't jump straight into it. She asked how I was doing, how work had been, whether I was still stationed in the same place. It was polite. It was also inefficient, which meant she was warming up to something. Eventually, she got there. She said the family was dealing with some compliance issues tied to a shipping partner. Nothing illegal, just messy. The kind of thing that made investors nervous if it wasn't handled carefully. She said she kept running into language she didn't fully understand and wondered if I could explain a few basics. No documents, no details, just general concepts. I hesitated, then agreed. Explaining public regulations wasn't a violation. It wasn't even close. I'd done it before for people outside my family. I told myself this was no different. I kept it high level. I explained how oversight worked, how certain reviews were triggered, what kind of wording raised red flags, and what kind didn't. I made it clear I couldn't advise beyond publicly available information. I said that more than once. She said she understood. She took notes while I talked. I could hear the pen moving across paper. That stood out to me. Vanessa was usually all screen, all device. Writing meant she was paying attention. After we hung up, I sent a follow-up email. Just a summary, bullet points, links to public sources, a sentence that spelled out my boundary in plain language. This is general information only. I can't provide guidance specific to your situation. I didn't do it to be dramatic. I did it because that's how I'd been trained. She replied quickly, thanked me, said it was helpful, added that it meant a lot to the family that I was willing to help. That line stuck with me. Not because it felt warm, but because it felt strategic. Over the next few weeks, she reached out more often. Always framed the same way. Just a quick question. Just clarifying something. Just trying to understand the landscape. Each time I answered carefully. Each time I followed up in writing. Each time she reassured me she wasn't asking for anything beyond that. At first it felt like progress. Like we'd found a version of our relationship that worked. She had a problem. I had knowledge. We kept it clean. No drama. Then I started noticing small shifts. She'd repeat phrases I'd used almost verbatim. Not common language. Specific wording. Terms most people outside my field wouldn't pick up naturally. She used them confidently like they'd always been part of her vocabulary. I brushed it off. People adopt language all the time. Then she mentioned a meeting. A big one. Investors. Partners. She said she'd be discussing process improvements and wanted to make sure she was using terms correctly. I reminded her again that I couldn't advise on specifics. She said she wasn't asking for that. Just wanted to avoid sounding uninformed. I believed her. Or maybe I wanted to. The first time I saw one of her decks, it was by accident. A mutual contact forwarded something and asked for my thoughts, assuming I'd already seen it. I opened the file and scanned the slides. The structure was familiar. The phrasing was familiar. The way risks were framed, the way safeguards were described. None of it was classified. None of it was technically wrong. But it was polished in a way that suggested more than surface understanding. My name wasn't on it. That wasn't the issue. My concern was how easily the line between explanation and attribution had blurred. I called her that night and asked where the language came from. She laughed it off. Said she'd picked it up from various conversations. Said that when you talk to enough people, things start to blend together. She reminded me that I hadn't shared anything sensitive. She was right about that. I let it go. The problem with family dynamics is that they come preloaded with trust. Not the kind you earn, the kind you inherit. You don't question it until it's already cost you something. She started referencing my background more openly. Not my role, but the fact that she had access to someone with it. My sister's in the Navy, she'd say casually, as if that explained her confidence. As if proximity equaled permission. I corrected her the first time, told her not to imply involvement. She apologized and said she'd be more careful. Then she did it again more subtly. A phrase here, an aside there, enough to suggest credibility without making a claim anyone could challenge directly. Each time I sent another email, clarifying, restating boundaries, documenting what had and hadn't been discussed. I wasn't accusing her of anything. I was keeping the record straight. At some point, the tone shifted. Her messages got shorter, less friendly, more urgent. She stopped asking questions and started making statements, checking them against my reaction. When I didn't push back, she took that as agreement. When I did, she acted surprised. She reminded me that this affected the whole family, that people were watching, that stress levels were high, that everyone was counting on her to keep things together. I recognized the move. It was the same one my parents used when they wanted compliance without debate. Make it about responsibility, about optics, about not being the one who caused trouble. I told her again what I could and couldn't do. I put it in writing. I kept my tone neutral. She didn't respond for a day. Then she sent a message that was short and direct. We need to talk about how this looks. I stared at the screen for a moment before setting the phone aside. The phrasing was careful. It wasn't a request. It was a reframing. What had started as a favor was being recast as an obligation. I went back to my work and finished the review I'd been in the middle of when her first message came in. The numbers lined up. The documentation was clean. Everything was where it was supposed to be. That contrast didn't escape me. In one world, clarity reduced risk. In the other, clarity created friction. And friction, I was starting to realize, was something my sister had very little patience for. I noticed the shift the moment people stopped asking questions and started nodding along. That's usually how it happens. When someone stops trying to understand and starts acting confident, instead it means they think they already own the narrative. Vanessa invited me to sit in on a call one afternoon, framing it as a courtesy. She said it might be helpful for me to hear how these conversations went just for context. I told her I couldn't participate, but listening in wasn't a problem. She agreed and said she'd keep me muted. The call was polished. Too polished. She walked through a series of talking points that sounded familiar in a way that made my shoulders tighten. The structure was clean. The terminology was precise. She framed risk the same way I did, not vaguely, but in the exact order I'd used when explaining how oversight worked. No one on the line questioned her. They didn't need to. She sounded like someone who knew what she was doing. Halfway through, someone asked how she developed such a clear understanding of the process. She smiled and said casually, "I've had some help from my sister. She's in the Navy." There it was. She didn't say I'd advised her. She didn't say I'd approved anything. She didn't say I was involved. She let the room do the math on its own. Heads nodded. Pens moved. The assumption landed and settled without resistance. I stayed muted. After the call, I emailed her. Short, direct. I told her she couldn't reference me that way. I told her it created a false impression. I told her I needed her to stop immediately. She replied within minutes. Said I was overthinking it. Said everyone knew I wasn't directly involved. Said it was just context. She added that mentioning my background helped people trust that she was taking compliance seriously. That was the first time I realized she wasn't confused. She was choosing. From then on, the pattern became harder to ignore. She reused phrasing I'd sent in emails, sometimes word for word. She framed decisions as if they were informed by internal insight without specifying what that meant. She spoke with authority that wasn't hers to claim, and she did it smoothly enough that no one pushed back. I wasn't angry. That came later. At first I was focused on control, on minimizing exposure. I sent another email restating boundaries. I forwarded previous messages where I'd drawn the line. I asked her to acknowledge in writing that I was not advising, endorsing, or involved. She responded with a single sentence. "I think you're misreading how this comes across." That was new. Until then, she'd at least pretended the issue was misunderstanding. Now she was implying the problem was my perception. The next deck I saw confirmed it. A colleague I trusted sent it over with a note asking if everything looked right. I opened it expecting more of the same. What I saw was cleaner, more confident. It wasn't just language anymore. It was framing. She presented safeguards as if they were already in place. She described review processes as if they'd been implemented, not proposed. It was just vague enough to avoid being an outright lie, but specific enough to inspire confidence. My contribution had been turned into a credential. I called her immediately. This time, she didn't warm up the conversation. She went straight into justification. She said pressure was high. She said timelines were tight. She said people needed reassurance. She said my background gave her credibility she couldn't afford to waste. I told her she was crossing a line. She paused, then said something that stuck with me. "You're not seeing the bigger picture." In her world, the bigger picture was momentum. Optics. Keeping things moving. If no one got hurt, The details didn't matter. In my world, the details were the whole point. I reminded her calmly that she didn't have permission to use my name or imply my involvement. I told her it put me at risk. I told her to remove any references immediately. She sighed. Actually sighed. Like I was being difficult. "I'm not taking credit for your work," she said. "You just helped a bit." That word landed hard. Helped. It reduced weeks of careful explanations and boundary setting into a favor she could reframe at will. It took something I'd done cautiously and turned it into something she owned. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I ended the call and documented it. Time, date, summary. Then I sent a follow-up email recapping the conversation and restating again what I was not involved in. She didn't respond. Over the next few days, I watched her confidence grow. Her messages stopped asking for input and started updating me on outcomes. Meetings went well. Feedback was positive. People were impressed. She used the same tone she'd always used when things were going her way. I started to see my role clearly. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't a consultant. I was a reference point she could exploit as long as I stayed quiet. The realization wasn't dramatic. It was practical. I reviewed every email, every text, every deck I could get my hands on. I lined them up against my responses. The contrast was obvious. Where I'd been cautious, she'd been expansive. Where I'd drawn lines, she'd blurred them. What bothered me most wasn't the credit. It was the risk. She was building trust on an implication that could unravel the moment someone asked the wrong question. And if that happened, it wouldn't be her clearance on the line. I raised the issue one more time, this time in writing with language that left no room for interpretation. I told her I needed confirmation that she would stop referencing me entirely. I explained why. I attached previous messages. I kept it factual. Her reply came late that night. It was longer than usual. She said she felt attacked. She said I was making things harder than they needed to be. She said the family was under pressure and I wasn't being supportive. She ended by saying she hoped I'd reconsider my tone. There it was again. Support, family, tone. The tools hadn't changed. The stakes had. I closed my laptop and sat back in the chair, letting the quiet of the room settle. On-base problems had solutions. You identified the risk, you addressed it, and you documented the fix. In my family, problems were managed by reshaping perception until they went away. I didn't need to decide anything yet. I just needed to stop pretending this was a misunderstanding. Once I accepted that, everything else started to fall into place. I forwarded the email to myself and added it to a folder I hadn't needed before. The name was boring on purpose. No emotion. Just a label I wouldn't have to explain if someone ever asked. I didn't feel paranoid doing it. I felt late. The first direct threat didn't sound like a threat at all. It came wrapped in concern. Vanessa called instead of texting, which was already a shift. She skipped the small talk and told me she was worried about how things could be interpreted if someone outside the family misunderstood my role. She said words like exposure and liability, like she'd just learned them and wanted to try them out. I let her talk. That was another habit I'd picked up. People reveal more when you don't rush them. She said there were advisors involved now. Lawyers, consultants, people who asked questions she didn't always know how to answer. She said one of them had raised a flag about conflicts of interest. She didn't name me, but she didn't have to. She said it might help if I clarified my position in a way that protected everyone. I asked what she meant by clarify. She said it would be cleaner if I acknowledged in writing that I'd been consulting informally, just to remove ambiguity. She said it didn't change anything in practice. It was just paperwork. Paperwork. The word landed differently for me than it did for her. I told her no. Not harshly. Not emotionally. Just no. I said I hadn't consulted. I'd answered general questions using public information. I said I wouldn't sign anything that suggested otherwise. There was a pause on the line. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Less friendly. More controlled. She said she was trying to protect me. She said that if someone else defined the story first, it might not go my way. She said she didn't want my career affected by something that could be handled internally. That's when I felt it. Not anger, not fear. A tightening in my chest that came from recognizing a familiar maneuver. This wasn't about protection. It was about control. I told her I'd need to talk to legal before responding to anything like that. I said it calmly. I didn't accuse her. I didn't raise my voice. She laughed. A short sound. Not amused. More dismissive. "You don't need a lawyer," she said. "We're family." I didn't answer right away. When I did, I told her family didn't override policy. I told her my obligations were clear. I told her I wasn't willing to blur them. She ended the call soon after. Within an hour, my mother called. That part hurt more than I expected. She used the same tone she'd always used when she wanted agreement without discussion. She said Vanessa was under a lot of stress. She said I needed to be flexible. She said people were counting on us to present a united front. I asked her if anyone had actually accused me of doing something wrong. She said that wasn't the point. I told her it was. She said I was being rigid, that I'd always been that way, that this was why I didn't fit easily into the family's world. She said if I cared about them, I'd help smooth things over instead of making them harder. There it was again. The same equation. Discomfort equals disloyalty. I ended the call without resolving anything and sat there longer than I meant to. I wasn't panicking. I was calculating. In my line of work, when something feels off, you stop assuming good intentions and start checking facts. I requested a meeting with a JAG officer the next day. Not to report anyone, not to escalate, just to ask questions. I laid out the situation plainly. No family names, no drama. Just a description of what I'd shared, what I hadn't, and what was being implied. The answer was clear. I hadn't done anything wrong. But perception mattered. If someone else framed my involvement incorrectly, it could become an issue I'd have to untangle later. I left that meeting with a knot in my stomach and a sense of relief that didn't last long. Knowing you're right doesn't protect you if someone else controls the narrative. That afternoon, an email came through from an address I didn't recognize. It was polite, professional. It asked me to confirm the nature of my interactions with the family business. It mentioned compliance review in vague terms. It didn't accuse me of anything. It just asked questions that assumed more involvement than I'd ever had. I replied carefully. I stated facts. I attached previous emails where I'd set boundaries. I clarified again what I had and hadn't done. I kept my tone neutral. I forwarded the response to my personal account and saved it. Vanessa called that evening furious. She said I'd blindsided her. She said involving outsiders made things worse. She said I was creating a paper trail that could be misread. I told her the paper trail already existed. I was just making sure it was accurate. She said if this went further, she couldn't guarantee how it would reflect on me. She said people with influence didn't like surprises. She said maybe I should think about what I stood to lose. That was the moment the conversation crossed a line it couldn't come back from. Not because of what she said, but because of how easily she said it. Like leverage was just another tool in a kit she'd been using for years. I didn't respond to that comment. I ended the call and wrote everything down while it was still fresh. Exact phrasing, timestamps, context. I didn't add opinions, just facts. Over the next few days, the pressure increased. More emails, more calls, subtle suggestions that cooperation would make things easier. That silence would be interpreted poorly. That family handled things internally. I stopped engaging beyond written responses. I didn't explain myself. I didn't justify. I clarified and documented. It wasn't defiance. It was self-preservation. What surprised me wasn't how quickly things escalated. It was how comfortable everyone seemed with the escalation. As long as it stayed quiet, as long as it stayed within the family, the methods didn't matter. At work, my days stayed the same. Briefings, reviews, deadlines. No one there knew what was happening, and I wasn't about to change that. I did my job. I showed up prepared. I kept my record clean. At home, the messages kept coming. Some firm, some emotional, all designed to push me back into the role I'd stepped out of without announcing it. I didn't need to respond to every one of them. I just needed to make sure that if someone ever read the exchange from start to finish, the truth would be obvious without commentary. By the end of the week, it was clear this wasn't about resolving a misunderstanding. It was about forcing alignment. And for the first time, I understood that the risk I was managing wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was active, persistent, and coming from people who believed they had every right to apply it. I realized something was wrong when I stopped being included without anyone telling me I wasn't. No argument, no announcement, just absence. It showed up quietly the way things always did in my family when a decision had already been made. The first sign was a group text that went silent. It wasn't dramatic. One day it was there, full of updates and logistics and half-finished plans. The next day it wasn't. I checked to make sure I hadn't muted it by accident. I hadn't. My name was gone. No explanation. No follow-up. Then the calendar invites stopped coming. Not cancellations, just nothing. Events I used to hear about in passing never came up at all. I found out about them the same way everyone else did through social media posts and secondhand comments that assumed I already knew. When I did hear from family, it was filtered. Short messages, neutral tone, information stripped of context. It felt less like communication and more like damage control. I didn't confront anyone about it. Not because I didn't notice, but because confronting it would have meant pretending it was accidental. It wasn't. This was strategy. Quiet, clean, and effective. Vanessa didn't call. She didn't text. The urgency she'd had a week earlier vanished. That told me everything I needed to know. She didn't need me engaged anymore. She needed me out of the way. My parents followed her lead without saying so outright. My mother checked in once asking how work was going. Not details, just enough to maintain the appearance of concern. My father sent a message about the weather back home, like we were distant relatives catching up. I answered politely, briefly. I didn't ask questions that would force honesty. I didn't push for clarity. I was watching how the system worked when it didn't think I was watching. The gala appeared in pieces. A venue mentioned here, a catering decision there. It wasn't presented to me as an event I was invited to or excluded from. It was just something happening around me without me. That distinction mattered. At one point, I almost assumed I'd imagined my inclusion. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe I'd filled in a blank that was never meant for me. That kind of self-doubt comes easily when people stop acknowledging you directly. It's efficient. You do the erasing for them. Then Vanessa texted. There was no build-up, no softening. Just the line I'd already read too many times in my head. Don't come tonight. It's all elites. You don't belong. Seeing it again didn't sting the way it had the first time. It clarified things. This wasn't about logistics or stress or timing. It was about control. She was closing a door and making sure I knew I wasn't meant to knock. I didn't respond. Not because I was hurt, but because responding would have confirmed the hierarchy she was trying to enforce. Silence was the only answer that didn't put me back in my assigned place. That evening, I watched the family erase me in real time. Photos went up. Smiles. Toasts. Familiar faces clustered together in rooms I recognized. The captions were careful. Family. Legacy. Together. Words chosen to imply completeness. No one asked where I was. No one tagged me. No one mentioned my absence. That was the point. You can't explain what you don't acknowledge. I didn't scroll for long. I didn't need to. I already knew how the story was being told. What surprised me wasn't the exclusion. It was how normal it felt. How easily everyone slipped into their roles. Vanessa at the center. My parents flanking her proud and composed. The extended network orbiting comfortably around them. I thought about all the times I'd stepped aside to make that picture cleaner. All the times I'd answered questions vaguely so the conversation could move on. All the times I'd accepted being the quiet one so no one had to feel awkward. This was the logical end of that pattern. At work, none of this existed. The next morning, I sat through a briefing where my input was expected and used. A junior officer asked a question and waited for my answer. A supervisor followed up on a point I'd raised the week before. No one hesitated. No one looked past me. That contrast was sharp enough to feel physical. Back home, the silence deepened. I wasn't blocked. That would have been obvious. I was simply removed from circulation. Messages passed around me. Decisions happened without me. It was exclusion without confrontation, which meant no one had to defend it. I documented it anyway. Not because I planned to use it, but because it was happening. Dates, messages, screenshots, not emotions, just facts. Vanessa eventually sent another message. Short, neutral. She asked if I was upset. Not what she'd done, just whether I was reacting poorly to it. I didn't answer. That choice wasn't dramatic. It was practical. Engaging would have pulled me back into a conversation framed entirely on her terms. Silence kept the boundary where it was. I stopped checking social media. I stopped expecting updates. I stopped assuming I'd be looped in. Those were habits, and habits can be broken once you stop pretending they're harmless. What took longer was accepting that this wasn't temporary. This wasn't a cooling off period. This was a reclassification. I had been moved from family member to liability, from participant to risk factor. The realization settled slowly without panic. In my line of work, when a system excludes you, it's usually because you no longer serve its function. That doesn't mean the system is right. It means it's consistent. I didn't need to argue with that consistency. I just needed to stop fighting it. By the end of the week, the pattern was unmistakable. No messages asking for clarification. No attempts to smooth things over. Just a clean break that everyone pretended was mutual. I kept doing my job. I kept my routines. I kept my records. I didn't announce my distance or explain my silence. I let the absence stand on its own. Because once you're erased without explanation, there's nothing left to negotiate. I opened my laptop and lined up the files the same way I did before an inspection, neat and boring enough to disappear into the background. There was no dramatic moment where I decided to fight back. It felt more like switching from denial to maintenance. You stop hoping a problem resolves itself and start making sure it can't damage you further. The first thing I did was stop talking on the phone. Not just with my family, but with anyone connected to them. If someone called, I let it go to voicemail. If they texted, I responded once clearly and only in writing. I wasn't trying to trap anyone. I was making sure there was a record that didn't rely on memory or interpretation. I pulled every email I'd exchanged with Vanessa and put them in chronological order. I highlighted the parts where I'd drawn boundaries. I flagged the moments where she'd acknowledged them. I saved copies to a personal drive that never left my apartment. It wasn't paranoia. It was standard procedure when something moved from uncomfortable to risky. At work, I asked for a quick check-in with a senior officer I trusted. I didn't mention family names or events. I framed it as a hypothetical. What happens if someone outside your command implies involvement you didn't have? How do you protect yourself without escalating? He didn't hesitate. He told me to keep everything documented and avoid informal communication. He told me to assume anything not written could be reshaped later. That matched what I was already doing. It helped to hear it said out loud. I drafted a final email to Vanessa and read it 3 times before sending. It wasn't angry. It wasn't emotional. It laid out facts. What I had shared. What I had not. It stated clearly that I was not advising, consulting, or endorsing anything related to her work or the family business. It asked her to confirm in writing that she would stop referencing my background in any capacity. I didn't add anything about family. I didn't mention trust or disappointment. I didn't need to. Those words wouldn't protect me. She replied hours later with a message that managed to say very little while implying a lot. She said she felt blindsided. She said my email made it sound like I didn't trust her. She said she hoped we could handle things privately instead of creating unnecessary complications. I replied once more. I clarified that the email wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement of record. I asked again for confirmation. She didn't respond. Instead, an email arrived from a consultant tied to the family business. It was framed as a routine inquiry. They wanted to understand the scope of my involvement, if any, so they could accurately assess risk. The wording assumed there was something to assess. I answered the same way I'd answered before. Brief, precise. I attached documentation. I removed ambiguity. I didn't accuse anyone of misrepresentation. I simply corrected it. That was the moment things shifted. Messages started coming from unexpected directions. An old acquaintance asking if I was still involved with my family's work. A vague LinkedIn request from someone who'd attended one of Vanessa's presentations. Nothing overt. Just small signals that the implication she'd created was now being examined by people who didn't share her incentives. Vanessa called that night. I didn't pick up. She texted instead. The tone was sharper than before. She said I was overreacting. She said my responses were making people nervous. She said I needed to think about the impact on our parents. I didn't answer right away. I reread her message, then added it to the folder. The one with the boring name. What I felt then wasn't satisfaction or fear. It was clarity. The system that had erased me was now reacting to the absence it had created. Without my cooperation, the assumptions it relied on couldn't hold their shape. Over the next few days, I kept my routine exactly the same. I went to work. I met deadlines. I followed procedure. I didn't gossip. I didn't hint. I didn't tell anyone what was happening. The only thing that changed was how carefully I protected the edges. Another email arrived, this time requesting a call. I declined and offered to answer questions in writing. That alone changed the tone. The follow-up questions became more cautious. The assumptions softened. When everything has to be written down, people think twice about what they imply. At home, the silence from my family deepened. No updates. No check-ins. My mother didn't ask how I was. My father didn't send his usual one-line messages. That told me they'd chosen a side, even if they weren't ready to say it out loud. I didn't take it personally. I took it as confirmation. Late one afternoon, I received a forwarded message from a contact I trusted. It was a brief note from someone who'd attended one of the earlier meetings. They said they were hearing different versions of the same story and wanted to make sure they understood what was actually true. They asked if I was involved. I replied with a single sentence, "I'm not involved and I've never represented otherwise." I attached my previous clarifications. The response came quickly. A thank you. An acknowledgement. No follow-up questions. That's how it spreads. Not as a headline, as quiet corrections moving through a network that values credibility more than loyalty. Vanessa sent one last message that week. It was longer, emotional. She said she felt betrayed. She said she didn't recognize me anymore. She said I was choosing rules over family. I read it once and archived it. Not because it didn't matter, but because responding would have pulled me back into a frame I'd already exited. I wasn't choosing rules over family. I was choosing reality over performance. By then I could feel the tension shifting even without direct evidence. The confidence in earlier communications was gone. The urgency had turned defensive. Questions were being asked by people who didn't accept vague answers. I didn't celebrate any of that. I didn't even think of it as revenge. Revenge is loud. This was administrative. It was the natural outcome of removing myself from a story that depended on my silence to work. I shut down my laptop at the end of the day and packed my bag for the morning. Outside, the base was settling into its evening rhythm. Lights on, doors closing, people moving with purpose. Whatever was happening in my family's world, it was no longer happening with my cooperation. And that I'd learned was often enough to change the entire equation without raising your voice. The first sign wasn't a phone call. It was a pause. I noticed it in an email thread I'd been quietly copied on, one I hadn't asked to be included in, but hadn't removed myself from either. Someone asked a straightforward question about oversight. Normally, Vanessa would have replied within minutes, confident and polished. This time, hours passed. When the response finally came, it was shorter, less assured. The language had changed just enough to stand out. That was when I knew the tone had shifted. That evening, the gala photos started appearing online. The venue looked exactly like I'd imagined: soft lighting, expensive flowers. People dressed like they belonged in rooms with high ceilings. My parents stood near the entrance in one shot, smiling the way they always did when everything was under control. Vanessa was in the center of most of them, glass-raised posture perfect. I didn't linger on the images. I didn't need to. I'd spent my whole life watching how those scenes worked. What interested me more were the gaps. The people who weren't tagged. The familiar names missing from the comments. The likes that didn't show up. During events like this, there's always a quiet layer beneath the celebration. Conversations that don't make it into photos. Questions asked in low voices. People who step aside instead of stepping closer. That layer doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates. I was finishing up some paperwork when my phone rang. Vanessa's name lit up the screen. I let it ring until it stopped. A minute later, a text came through. "Can you call me?" I didn't respond. 10 minutes passed. Another call. Then another text, longer this time. She said there were misunderstandings spreading. She said people were getting confused. She said I needed to help her clear things up. I stayed where I was and kept doing what I'd been doing. The work in front of me had deadlines that didn't care about family crises. The next message came in sharper. She said she didn't understand why I was being so rigid. She said the timing was bad. She said I was choosing the worst possible moment to make a point. That word again. Point. As if this were a tactic instead of a consequence. I finally replied once, "Everything I've said is accurate." That was it. No explanation, no reassurance. Her response came almost immediately. "This is hurting us." Us didn't mean family. It meant the image. As the night went on, the messages changed tone. The confidence I'd heard on those earlier calls was gone. In its place was urgency. Not panic exactly. More like someone realizing the floor wasn't as solid as they'd thought. At some point after midnight, an unfamiliar number called. I didn't answer. A voicemail followed. It was polite. Measured. Someone introduced themselves as an advisor and said they wanted to clarify a few things. They said there seemed to be conflicting understandings about my role. I didn't return the call. I forwarded the voicemail to my personal account and added it to the folder. The next morning, I woke up to a different kind of quiet. My phone was still. No new messages from Vanessa. No check-ins from my parents. The noise had stopped all at once, like a switch had been flipped. That silence told me more than the calls had. At work, the day unfolded normally. Meetings, updates, a quick conversation with a colleague about a delayed delivery. No one mentioned my family. No one hinted at anything else. That separation mattered. It reminded me that the world didn't revolve around one event, no matter how important it felt to the people hosting it. Around midday, an email came in from someone higher up the chain, not accusing us, not alarmist. Just a note acknowledging my previous clarifications and thanking me for being responsive. They said they'd adjusted their understanding accordingly. That was it. No drama. No confrontation. Just a quiet recalibration. I leaned back in my chair for a moment and let that settle. This was the part people don't talk about when they imagine revenge. There was no satisfaction in it. No rush. Just the steady realization that when information is accurate and consistent, it moves on its own. Later that afternoon, Vanessa called again. I answered this time. She didn't start with anger. She started with disbelief. She said she couldn't believe I'd let things get this far. She said people were questioning her credibility. She said she was being asked things she didn't have clean answers for anymore. I listened without interrupting. She said I'd embarrassed the family. She said our parents were upset. She said I'd blindsided everyone by refusing to play along. I told her I hadn't blindsided anyone. I'd been clear from the beginning. She went quiet. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. She asked what I wanted. The question caught her off guard more than it did me. I want the record to be accurate, I said. That's it. She said that wasn't enough. She said people didn't care about records, they cared about perception. She said fixing this would require cooperation. I didn't argue with her. I didn't correct her worldview. I just told her I wasn't available to help reshape anything. She ended the call without saying goodbye. That night, more messages came in from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Neutral questions. Careful wording. Each one hinted at the same thing: the story they'd been hearing didn't hold together anymore. I answered only what was asked. I attached documentation where it made sense. I didn't volunteer opinions or speculate about motives. I let the facts stand on their own. By the end of the night, the pattern was clear. The gala had gone on as planned. The speeches had been made. The photos had been taken. But beneath all of that, something had shifted. The confidence that had carried my family's image for years was thinning. Not collapsing, Not exploding, just cracking quietly under the weight of questions that couldn't be smoothed over with charm. I shut off my phone and sat in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the distant sounds of the bass settling down. There was no urge to check messages again. No need to see how things were unfolding in real time. Whatever came next would move at its own pace. And for the first time, that pace wasn't being set by my sister's ability to control the room. I didn't block anyone right away. I just stopped reaching for my phone every time it buzzed. That small change did more than any dramatic gesture ever could. Messages came in slower after that. When they did arrive, they were cautious. Like whoever sent them wasn't sure which version of me they were talking to anymore. The first call from my father came late, well after work hours. I answered because ignoring him felt unnecessary, not because I expected clarity. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse me of anything. He said he'd heard there were questions circulating and wanted to understand what was happening. I told him exactly what I'd told everyone else. What I had shared. What I hadn't. Where I'd drawn the line. I didn't editorialize. I didn't bring up the gala. I didn't mention the text. I kept it factual. He listened longer than I expected. When he finally spoke, he said he wished I'd been more flexible. He said things might have gone smoother if I'd trusted the family to handle it internally. I asked him if smooth was the same thing as accurate. He didn't answer that. My mother sent a message the next day. It was softer. She said she hated how divided things felt. She said she missed talking to me the way we used to. She said she didn't recognize the distance anymore. I read it twice before replying. Then I told her the distance hadn't appeared overnight. It had just stopped being managed for appearances. She didn't respond. Vanessa didn't reach out again. Not directly. I heard about her through others. People who asked careful questions. People who framed things as concern instead of curiosity. The same network that had once amplified her confidence was now recalibrating quietly without asking permission. At work, nothing changed. That was the part that grounded me. I still showed up. I still had responsibilities. I still had people relying on me to do things correctly and on time. No one there asked me to compromise my standards for the sake of harmony. They expected me to uphold them even when it was uncomfortable. That expectation was a kind of relief. A few weeks later, I received a formal acknowledgement from someone I'd been corresponding with. They thanked me for my cooperation and confirmed that their understanding of my role had been updated. The language was neutral. The tone was final. Whatever assumptions had been floating around were no longer floating freely. I closed the email and didn't forward it to anyone. The thing about revenge is that people imagine it as a release, a payoff, a moment where you feel vindicated and seen. That wasn't what this was. There was no celebration, no victory lap. Just a steady sense that the risk had been contained and the truth had landed where it needed to. What surprised me most was how little satisfaction I felt and how much relief there was in that. I hadn't wanted anyone to fail. I'd wanted myself to be safe. The rest had taken care of itself. Over time, the messages from extended family slowed to a trickle. Some were awkward. Some tried to reestablish normalcy without acknowledging what had happened. I answered a few. I ignored others. I stopped feeling obligated to manage anyone else's comfort. Vanessa's name came up once in a conversation with a mutual contact. They said she was recalibrating, reevaluating. That was the word they used. I didn't ask for details. My parents adjusted too in their own way. Fewer updates. Fewer invitations framed as expectations. The distance settled into something quieter, less performative. It wasn't reconciliation. It was reality. One evening after a long day, I sat in my apartment and looked around at the life I'd built without asking for approval. It wasn't impressive in the way my family valued. No grand views, no curated guest list, just space that belonged to me and a schedule I didn't have to justify. In the Navy, belonging isn't granted because you fit an image. It's earned by showing up, following through, and being accountable when things go wrong. It's not warm. It's not sentimental. But it's honest. That honesty had reshaped me in ways I didn't fully appreciate until everything else fell away. It taught me how to draw lines without apologizing, how to let silence stand when explanations only create more leverage for someone else, how to protect myself without turning into the person I was protecting myself from. If there was a lesson in all of this, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about understanding where your value actually comes from. In my family, value was something assigned adjusted, depending on optics and usefulness. In my work, value was something you demonstrated day after day without shortcuts. I didn't cut anyone off dramatically. I didn't make announcements. I just stopped performing. I stopped filling gaps that weren't mine to manage. I stopped shrinking to keep a story intact. And in that space, something unexpected happened. I felt lighter. Not because things were resolved, but because they were clear. Whatever my family chose to believe after that was theirs to carry. I'd already done what I needed to do. I'd kept my record clean. I'd kept my word. I'd stayed where I belonged even when others tried to tell me I didn't. The Navy didn't teach me how to get even. It taught me how to stand still while the noise sorted itself out. That turned out to be more effective than anything I could have planned. I didn't tell this story to make anyone look bad or to prove that I was right. I told it because situations like this happen more often than people admit, especially in families where image matters more than honesty. Family drama doesn't always come with yelling or slammed doors. Sometimes it shows up as silence pressure and quiet rewrites of the truth. For me, serving in the U.S. Navy taught me something my family never did. Your value isn't decided by who includes you, but by how you carry yourself when it would be easier to fold. If this felt familiar, if you've lived through your own version of a family revenge story or been pushed out for not fitting the mold, you're not alone. Subscribe to the channel for more real stories about family conflict, personal boundaries, and finding your footing when the people closest to you make it harder instead of easier.